What's going on, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Event Marketing Redefined. I am your host, Matt Kleinrock, CEO of Rockway Exhibits and Events. Today, we're talking getting the most out of your trade show investment. I have a fellow New Jerseyan here, Minal Shah, and she is here to join me. She has been an event marketer currently with Salesforce, previously with Benjamin Moore and Common Worldwide, and we're excited to have her to talk this topic. Minal, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, Jersey stand up, right? You are in Jersey actually right now, right?
I am. I'm based out of Hoboken or like the New York City office, but I hope we fist pump by the end of this episode.
I'm sure there'll be some fist bumping. Yes, of course. All right. So let's talk. I mean, pretty simple topic today, right? But a lot to cover. It's basically saying getting the most out of your trade show investment. I think for me, like what this always makes me think of like, the trade show investment's a big investment, right? Everybody
Yeah.
talks about it. The costs are high. So I think kind of where trade shows are coming full circle nowadays is essentially like the days of just going just to show up, just to support the association and just to throw a booth out there are kind of coming to an end. People are really being pressured, especially event marketers like yourself and others, you know, from executives to say, like, what are we doing here? Like, do we make a return? Is this worth our while? Is this pushing objectives? So I think where everything is going is you need a kind of 360 cohesive strategy to going to this trade show. So one of the first things I want to start with you on is something that I think is super important. And I think it's an event marketer's job. And it is creating alignment in the organization, both above them, but laterally when going to a third party trade show. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the way I look at trade shows is everything that's happening within the company, your whole focus is to get it out there, right? Like you want to make sure that all parties are aligned. Like when I worked with Benjamin Moore, even at Salesforce, we're aligning with our sales teams, we're aligning with our field marketing teams, we're aligning with our social team, our digital team, our demand gen team, just to make sure everyone's aware that A, one, this is happening, and B, to make sure everyone's equally invested. I think one of the biggest things on this is making sure you have enough time to invest and get the most out of your show. I've definitely seen it where it's like, okay, we have a 1 month turnaround. We're going to go do this. And you don't always get the most out of that because you're kind of in a reaction mode versus a more strategic and thought process mode to get the most out of it.
I like what you said. There are two things. One was being equally invested, and the other was like what's happening at the company and get it out there, right? So the equally invested to me is really what alignment is, right? Like as
Mhm.
the event person, sometimes people fall in line of just being an executor, but you can't
Yeah.
be. You have to be the event marketer, right? And the execution is just a part of the job. And part of being the event marketer is making sure, does sales know what's going on, right? Do they
Yep.
have skin in the game? Does leadership, are we aligned with the second thing you said? What's happening at the company and what does everybody need to know about it, right?
Yeah.
What's going on with marketing? Are they going to help me fuel this thing? And creating that across the board. Do you have anything maybe you've done in the past where like the way you work with the different departments and things like that has helped you create alignment?
So back at Benjamin Moore, we had a big spreadsheet, huge. And I
Yeah.
say huge in the sense of all of the shows that we were at that were anything bigger than a 20 by 20. We had a massive spreadsheet. We started to outline what products we were going to be having at each of those, trade shows, when product launches were, any other key events. It kind of turned into our master calendar, but it turned into a strategy calendar really because it also started to fill in like, okay, what creative needs do we have? What giveaways are we giving away? And then it also turned into a part two of it of, well, how did it go? How many scans did we get? How many things did we give away? So that way you also have a benchmark for the following year if you're gonna go ahead and re-sign at the show or not. So I think a lot of it was having that massive spreadsheet also got everyone else aligned. And
Yeah.
so what ended up happening was everyone started to look at that and they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to base my social plan around this, my digital strategy around this, because this is kind of starting to spearhead what direction we need to go in to be in a lockstep motion to get the most out of our marketing, not just at trade shows, but a whole perspective. So that's like a way I guess I would say is like if you're looking for a place to
Yeah.
start, put it all in one location and
I
then
love
start
that.
tagging people in it.
It's kind of like so I've heard some people refer to it similarly as like a North Star, where they have like a document that has
Yeah,
everything in it. But I like what you're saying, which is like, I'm gonna get this thing so like detailed and dialed into the company and the goals and the initiatives that like you could use this for so many different things. And I think
yeah.
that does create the alignment. I talked the other day, I wrote a post where I was saying how like you really need sales to understand what they're walking into. Because there's people to a degree that don't really want salespeople at the trade shows. They think they're not a great fit for being there. And I understand that sentiment to a degree at times, but it's like you need to get everybody on the bus. Hey, this is why we're here. This is what we're accomplishing. This is the theme. This is the concept. This is the goals and objectives, and like feed them the information, be the organizer, be the orchestrator. And I love that you have a document that does that. That's great.
Yeah, it really does help. And I also think what it does is it helps you understand what balance needs to be there. Once you have those objectives there, you're able to say, okay, is this more of a selling show or is this more of a, PR based show where we need to have more marketers there?
Mhm.
So I think it's really when you have it all on paper, you're able to outline the needs and the asks like that you need from like all of the other parties involved.
Nice. Let's talk a little bit of money, right? Let's talk cost savings. Everybody wants to save costs when they go. Costs are high. Everything's high. The space is high. The sponsorships are high. The material handling's high. The electric's high. The drayage is high. I'm sure people think my cost is high. Right? Just go, everything is just high, right? Everything's expensive. But I always say when it comes to cost savings, just in general, is particularly on my side, is I say to people like that $100,000 that you're going to spend on the booth and everything, it's not created equal in the sense that what is the process that you're going through to get there? So as I can see the booth
Mhm.
that you've created and launched and the activation you've made at the trade show for 100 grand, and I could start asking questions as to how you got there, because all exhibits are not created equal, in my opinion. So how can you
Totally.
better utilize that 100? But then the other side of it, I think, is across the board, logistics, your team, your offsite stuff, how you negotiate sponsorships, all those things. Where have you seen the ability to reduce your liability, save cost, and kind of be smart when you're going to trade shows?
Yeah, so I have a couple of points on this. The first one is planning ahead. If you're able to plan ahead, you can hit that first stage deadline and get in at a lower cost. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, one of the things I've said in the past is like getting scrappy. The way that I designed a lot of our booths at Benjamin Moore was to kind of outline the shell and kind of figure out like, okay, this is the shell of our booth and we can use it in this many ways. Like this is how modular this booth is going to be. So you're getting the most out of that custom build of a booth if you're doing custom build, right? And kind of tweaking it accordingly to make it feel new to customers that may have seen it or they might, there's always the customers that go year over year, they're always there, but like switching it up just enough like that with that fresh coat of paint or whatever it might be, it makes that custom build like that overall cost go down each time you use it. So that was another way. The other thing that I think is really important is sponsorships. If you have a very clear goal in mind of what you want to share, if you're doing a product launch, if you're trying to show off like, hey, look at like our education, learning, continued education that we're offering, all of that comes in at like what you're negotiating is what you're going to get out of it. So the more prescriptive you are with those show organizers that are creating that sponsorship packet for you, the better your landing is going to be. And the more worthwhile your investment is going to be. A great example I have when we did IDS West, we partnered with them for a couple of years and we had gotten the chance to meet on site. And when we met with them, they were like, "What's your main goal?" And we're like, "Well, we're actually launching this whole new product. We would love to partner up with a local artist and create the entryway for the show." And they're like, "Wait, really? That's what you want to do?" And we're like, "We had no idea." And so then we were like, we're riffing back and forth. We're talking about it. And I'm like, "Hey, like, in addition to this, can you add in like a session or two? Could you add in a press release? Could you
Yeah.
add in an email out from us, to welcome them to the show?" So it's kind of figuring out like those little nuances of like how specific can you get in the contract to get the most out of your buck.
I love that example of working through sponsorships, because I think it's a really popular conversation right now, because the way I've kind of outlined it, or I see it at this point, is like, okay, you had trade shows pre-COVID. You had an 18-month or 20-month break, essentially. Everybody took a nap. Then you woke back up and things got, going again. And I think a lot has changed and a lot has happened, and the buyers' behaviors have changed and event attendees' behaviors all to a degree. And that is something that a lot of event marketers are questioning. They're saying, well, you're offering me the same stuff you offered me 4 years ago. You're still
Yeah.
offering me the same thing. I'm not getting results from having my name on a lanyard. What can you get me that's more experiential? How can you get creative? So I love the idea of asking, right? I mean, ask, what do you have? What ideas do you have to change up your sponsorships and better utilize your funds as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's important to come to the table with a POV of what you want and then take it from there together because it is a partnership,
Yeah.
sponsorship, right?
I think it also, what it makes me think of what you're saying is like, I'm a huge proponent of like, you got to check what you've always done. You got to check yourself, right? It's like, you have to be like, are we just taking the playbook from last year and running it again this year? And if you keep doing it over and over, like, yeah, that worked. Yeah, that worked. Yeah, it's good. And it's like, I think you can find wasted dollars in there all the time.
All
Like,
the time.
where, like, all right, we spend $200,000 in total. Let's take a look. And like, I just think you can find 10, 15, or 20 that's better usage, that you can keep the same spend, but you can do stuff differently, or you can really find areas to reduce. And I think it's just that mindset of thinking to yourself, how do we do this better? How do we do this better? And how do we double check ourselves?
I 100% agree because I think when you fall into the, well, this is the what we've always done mode,
Yeah.
I think you lose out on innovation. You lose out on just up leveling an experience, right? Like what you
Yeah.
did last year isn't always going to work. Trends are changing, people's expectations are changing. It's always how do you one up yourself is something that I think companies, if you want to add more pizzazz to what you're doing, that's an easy way of saying that or doing that. And I also think it goes back to I wanted to take one step back because I just thought of one more point that I wanted to touch on is messaging. Like when we're doing all this
Yeah.
alignment with all of the various like customers and or customer internal customers, if you will, right? How do you make sure it's a cohesive message that you're putting out? I think is important. What do you want that consumer to walk away knowing after being at your booth? I
Yeah.
think is key because it's so easy to be there and you have like a bunch of marketers coming at you and they're like everything's equally important but like you need to figure out what you need to
It's not.
prioritize. It's
Everything's
not.
not equally important. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the attention span at these shows are so you know you get you're lucky if you have 5 minutes with a customer, right? Like
Mhm.
what are you going to get to them and their point across and how are you going to do it? I think is really important too, in general. So I just wanted to like call that out as well. That messaging is key and making sure it's concise and cohesive.
I like that you went back to messaging. I do think messaging is key. We're actually working with a company right now and we're helping them work on a trade show booth for the fall. And the conversations are really interesting. They are very much so working on their point of view as a company, which I think is a newer thing that companies are working. It's not just messaging, it's their point of view on the market, their product, like that. And as we're dialing that in and having these conversations, it is like, okay, if your point of view is a paragraph, it can't be, right? How do we take that paragraph? Great, it sounds nice, but it's got to come out in one way, in one theme, in one message that people leave with, because you're not leaving with two, three, or four. Nobody wants to read your features and benefits on a wall. You can tell them your feature and benefits or all the locations I mean, gosh, the bullet points I see on trade show booths. It's like no one's really reading them. I mean, no one's
No one's reading
reading
it.
them. Got to have
No
that
one's stopping to read
dialed in.
it. I agree. I think so. One of the ways we do that at Salesforce is before any kickoff, we do a V2 mom. So it's your visions, values, your
Yep.
obstacles, your metrics, and your methods. So when you have all of that together, you're able to understand the direction and the POV of the show or the
Yep.
purpose of whatever it is you're going about, whether it's a trade show, an event, what have you. And so I think when you do that and you bring that POV to the customers, you're able to almost help them narrow in on what they're trying to get out of it because I think the more specific you are, the better your result.
Yeah. Let's kind of go into like, I want to talk about like overall strategy, right? There
Sure.
was, I think Bethany Murphy was on my show. She works for Six Sense and she said something was really great. And she just summed it up and she was like, your trade shows and your events are just not a single point in time. And I was like,
Mhm.
man, that makes so much sense. And it really goes back to the pre-show, during, the post. It's a cycle and everything's kind of going together. And I love that because it makes you think outside the box. Doesn't make you think like, oh, we're at this event, we need to do this. It's like, you can imagine the event to be a 9 week stretch. You can imagine it to be 6 months, a year, a cyclical thing, however you want. Tell me a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of avenues to go on this, but I want to hear from you. Like, if you are going to a trade show, you're planning your company's trade show, whatever it is, right? In any role, any seat, any company you would be doing, like, what are the like things you're thinking about, not to save money, but to be effective, to go drive results, to be strategic and say, hey, we're going here for a reason. And I need to make sure that those things start to come to fruition.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is you're going in with a purpose, right? Like you
Yep.
understand that there is a strategy, there's an opportunity cost of you not being there. Like if you pull out, you're like, oh, well, but our competitors are there. So if you're not there, it's kind of don't get to have the space to have those conversations with those customers, and those customers go elsewhere. One of the most successful strategies I've had was at MiaCon. I think it was like 2018 or 2019, and we were doing a new product launch. We were rebranding at Benjamin Moore, the Gen X colorant that they had.
Yep.
And one of the biggest things was like they had really cool marketing that went with it. Like the visuals were really nice. It was a very artsy, art decor heavy type of show. And we were like, well, how do we get this story out there? Because this has been our biggest pain point at this point for a really long time, of understanding the differentiator, or having consumers understand the differentiator of why our colorant is better. And so we literally, what we did was we created a journey through the booth that kind of debunked the myths, without talking down to our competitor. We visually showed the difference of what happens when you're trying to color match, or what happens when you're utilizing, one coat versus two coats of the product.
Mm.
And then also did a product launch within that. And so it created this journey through the booth where we had the year prior, I think we had like 2,000 bags that we gave away and like 2,000 scans. And this year we ended up giving away, I think, like 5,000 bags, and we ran out of bags to the point where people were like, we're out of bags. And they're like, oh, that's okay. We still want to come and learn because you made this so digestible for us. So I think it's a lot of like the strategy is looking at it from a consumer mindset. Like, what are they going to be able to walk away learning? And how do you make it digestible? Like, the bullet points aren't going to land. Like, how many times do you see a massive gator board, meter board sign with instructions of what to follow? And most of the time, you have to put someone outside of that next to it anyway to tell them this is what you're reading. Right. So I think it's really looking at it from a customer point of view and figuring out what that big, shiny, relevant art object is to draw customers into your space, and then creating the strategy around it. I think a lot of what we do, even at Salesforce, is looking at customer stories, and we're like, okay, well, what success stories can we share out to make it more relevant? And how do we make that shiny and attractive for consumers on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I mean, those are good examples. Like, right? That's just a great walkthrough of what you did at Benjamin Moore that time, because I think that can really give people ideas on how to say, okay, like that was an initiative, that was a problem you guys were facing. You were trying to figure out how to explain this better. But I think like one thing you said in the beginning was purpose. What is
Mm-hmm.
your purpose? Like, why are you really there? Like, very few
Yep,
times people are clear on that. They're like, oh, we want leads. I'm like, no, 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 no.
totally.
More than that. Give
More
me
than
more.
that.
Great. We all want leads. I want to lead right now. Like literally, I want to lead right this second too. I get it, but like what else? Like it has to be deeper than that. And I think what it kind of shifts into is two things: audience and initiatives to me.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like much of what you do should be rooted in your audience, not in what you think is cool or what you think you want to tell them. Let's talk about them. Why are they there? Who are they? What
Yeah.
problems are they trying to solve? What's burning in their professional life that you can help with? And then the initiative is kind of like, it's like if you were doing like a circle graph where they overlapped, it would be like audience and initiative. And then the initiative is your company. And it's like what you're saying at Benjamin Moore. What are the initiatives, the problems that you're having, whether it's conveying a message, launching something new, telling a different story about yourself, like
Yeah.
changing a notion that people have about you. And somewhere in that middle circle is where you need to land in your trade show booth and your everything activations, offsite, pre-show marketing, the engagements that you create. And I just think from purpose, that's kind of I can't draw the chart right now, but I should
I
draw it.
feel like we keep, just like three little
I'm
circles
getting there.
here.
Yeah, I have like a
I get
pad
it.
here.
I
I
like
think I
where your
have it, but
visualization. I like where
uh,
you're going with it. The visualizations in my head, I'll tell you that. I think a lot of it is like with purpose, it also goes back to like as clear as you can, because each team that you're working with is going to have a different purpose or a different stake in the game of why they want to show up to this. I think it's building that cohesive message together. And I also think a lot of it is understanding like the metrics, like what does success look like? At the end of this, how can we say this was a successful show?
yeah,
And like people don't always have that outlined, right? Like, is
no.
it more leads? Is it more new leads? Is it a specific audience? Like, are you trying to target C suite? Are you trying to get more of like, like that manager level? Like, be as specific as you possibly can, not just your purpose, but also the metrics to what success looks like. Because there are a ton of metrics that we can spit your way, right? Like, of what success could look like. And that can also vary by stakeholder, right? Like, for a salesperson, it's probably getting new leads or hot leads that they can carry and just dive right into the conversation
Yeah.
with. But for a marketing person, it might just be like general awareness or multiple PR articles coming out of it, right? Like,
Mm.
so it's
Yeah.
understanding that and those measures of success and pushing it out to like the internal teams of like, this is what success is going to look like for us together.
With you saying, I like just the simplicity of the question, the way you posed it, right? What is success? And it's like what does success look like at this event? And I think it's interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody and we were talking. It was like a consulting call that I was doing and talking about like their program and some of the things that they're thinking and the issues they're having. And it's kind of like they feel a little bit lost and they're just trying to kind of find the way to know which direction to push, if that makes sense. And one thing she mentioned I thought was really interesting was like an initiative. So, what does success look like can stem from initiatives. And it was that at the time, her CFO is on this trying to figure out how to reduce their churn, trying to figure out how to reduce people, whether it's unsubscribing, lessening their subscriptions, right? Reducing that churn.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's a huge initiative. So now how do you take that and put it into your events and your trade shows for 12-month cycle, but
Yeah.
show, hey, we're helping reduce churn. We're helping do this. This is what success looks like right now for the business, which may change in 24 months. And it could be different in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it does. It is a moving target, right? Like it always is a moving target. I think like, we have multiple product launches a year where our messaging is going to change like each time, which is what is, normal. I think especially with like everything on the market, I think it's also going back to like it's like being nimble. Like you can't be fully committed to like what you're doing. You got to be ready to like make that
Mm-hmm.
change. And it goes back to like what can we do better again next time around? So I think it's staying as flexible as you possibly can, but understanding like the deadlines that you have when you need to make like to call it and make the decision to move forward.
Let's talk about running like offsite stuff at trade shows, right? I love it. I think it's such a holistic play. I don't think enough people do it. I think they think just like the big companies throw some one big party banger type thing and that's it. But I think there's so many other avenues for being really targeted, delivering experiences. I know we're working with a company right now. We're discussing with them. It's like they have two kind of clients at a show, not two different kind of client. They have two of their targets. One is more of the person that they work with generally, and then the
Mm-hmm.
other is more the decision maker. So they're trying to kind of hit two different experiences for them at different times. And one of which is essentially their decision maker is not on the show floor ever. So they're doing these offsite higher end thing. They're executives, they're decision makers that they're essentially rolling out the carpet for. So talk to me a little bit about that. What is your take on doing offsite stuff at trade shows to kind of tie into the strategy?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is like it's how to maximize your time, right? Like when you're
Yep.
at a show or you're at one of these like, 3 day like, conferences, how are you engaging and getting to that attendance that you're looking for? And I think a couple like what we sometimes do is like hosting like the in booth happy hour, hosting something that's offsite, but partnering up with the sponsorship team. Like that's where that sponsorship comes into play again, where you're like, okay, like I want to target this attendance, working with the sponsorship team to get as specific as you can in that realm to try and host something offsite, I think is
Mm.
key. Super important. I think that's something that you can always look into. I think that those are your best avenues, to be honest, is like it's really looking at the sponsorships and saying, okay, like this is what we want to do, but like, lots of shows have things happening off campus. Like there's
Mhm.
always
Tons.
like that night owl, like the kickoff party,
Mhm.
the first night, whatever it might be. And it's like, well, maybe that's where you need to look at the metrics of that, right? Like
Yeah.
ask those questions to the show organizer. Who's showing up at these things?
Mhm.
And how do I get like this for this audience? Like work with them to get there is probably your best bet to get a successful off campus or off site event.
When you mentioned kind of like, I think, you know, you're in a single location for 3 to 4 days, 2 days, 3 days, or 4 days, whatever the show
Totally.
is, right? That kind of is the value proposition of a third party conference in a way. Like you're just getting everybody there. So to your point, maximizing it to me feels important, which makes kind of what I said about what Bethany said is like, your event is not a single point in time, right? So even on site, one of the trends I'm seeing now is people not going through sponsorships and doing their own thing, running their own engagement. I'm seeing a lot more niche, smaller, 10-person dinners, 300, 400 a head where they're making this rollout. And I think that's something that I've encouraged on like our clients is like, hey, like you're at this show and I understand you're seeking attendance, targeted audience. You have a rough idea how many people you want to get in touch with and talk to, but like who are the 20 people you need to talk to? Who are the 20 that could change things for your business? And how do you target them to deliver an experience to them offsite? Whether it's hosting conversations like this in a hotel lounge, going, like a dinner, a breakfast, a yoga thing. I don't know. There's a million different things
Yeah.
that you could do. But I think that targeted style offsite and running your own is becoming more and more relevant these days. I think to a fault, some people are not supporting the show and just running their own stuff. And it's kind of all over the place, honestly.
I think what in that regards, like what ends up happening is you got again, it goes back to looking at it from like the attendees POV. I think the more closer you are in like the lockstep with the show organizer, the better those results are going to be because there's so much noise out there to cut through and get that going is very difficult.
In the different roles that you've had, how do you familiarize yourself with the audience of that company, right? Like, I think that's so important going from, like, I think there's a difference between an event planner and an event marketer, right? And it's kind of a step up to me moving in that direction. Event marketers, both have to understand the audience, but I think it's just a little bit of a variance there in the job and difference.
Yeah.
How have you
And
understood your audience to be able to execute for them?
well, I think it also is understanding the various internal roles, right? Like first off, I know like enough to be dangerous in the various settings that I'm
Yeah.
working with. Like I'm leaning into curiosity with my internal stakeholders to understand what their goals are.
Yeah.
I also think from that, again, it goes back to the show organizer and it's understanding the data that they're collecting. What data do you need to make your decisions? To get that specific target market. Like that's what I'm looking at. Like when I'm like
Mhm.
trying to make decisions on whether I want to resign or not, I'm like, hey, what percentage of the folks that were here were X target?
Mhm.
What percentage of them were from this specific role within a company? So I think it's getting specific with them is really important and looking at the data to make your decisions. I think as event marketers, well, I think the question you're asking is like how do you differentiate yourself? And if you want to be an event marketer, I think for a while we were all following our guts, but now it's time to shift your mentality and look at what the data is telling you and make your decisions based off data. And most of the time, your gut and your data is probably going to line up, but it's looking at that to get buy-in from all of those other stakeholders that are like, well, I don't know if we need to be there, but it's like the recommendation is to be there. And this is why. So proving your case in that case and scenario.
So two things I want to go back to that you said. One is you said lean into curiosity when you were talking
Mhm.
about working with your internal stakeholders. Tell me a little bit about that because I think my take on that is that that's a high level thought process and it kind of gets you a seat at the table when you're in conversation because it means you're asking great questions and you're kind of learning the business end of things. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I think there's so many, everyone's always like, oh, I want to be a marketer. There's so many various functions to being a marketer. And I think it's understanding, it's leaning into the curiosity of like, oh, well, like, what programs are you working on? What
Mhm.
are you like, what's important to you? What does success look like to you? What launches are you working on? Like what excites you, right? Like
Yeah.
building those connections and understanding like the purpose of each of the teams that have a seat at the table. So then you can bring them together. I think it's a lot about leaning into curiosity because I think it's really easy for us to say, like, no, we don't need that. But like
Yeah.
in hindsight 2020, you're like, ooh, that would have been a really great add-on if we asked the right questions. Or sometimes I think what happens is like there might be the team that's like the loudest, that's getting the most attention. And that's totally okay. But it's asking them, why do you need this? Right. Like
Mhm.
I'm a big component of like asking why. Like, tell me why. My nephew always did that when he was younger, and it just always stuck to me. Is like, tell me why. Why do you
Yeah.
need this specific room in this specific setting? Help me understand so I can almost guide you to the right position. Like, once I understand more of the why, what you're asking for, I might be able to put it into something else versus creating an entire entity just for you. So I think it's when you lean into the curiosity, you can almost bring together more cohesive results.
I like that a lot. And I asked about it because I think from all the different conversations I'm having and, talking to event marketers, I think some of the better event marketers and event coordinators, event planners, event managers, whatever the title may be, is when they are talking with leadership and they are talking with stakeholders, by being curious and by asking business questions about the outcomes and the audience and the initiatives, they are elevating their status at that company as not just the event person, not just the
Yeah.
executor of the event person that's going to send them the agenda and get the flights booked and do, oh yeah, they do the event stuff. When they start asking those curious questions, those smart questions, people sit a little taller in the room and they're like, oh, okay, like they get this whole thing that's going on. They're not just executing the event and ordering this. So I
Yeah.
think that's a really important point, especially for, I think, for younger women, which typically are event planners, marketers. I mean, is predominantly a higher percentage of women than it is men. And I think for younger women to have that confidence, to hear you say it, and others that I've had on this show, which is like, feel free to ask these questions. You're not going to sound
Yeah.
stupid, right? You're going to sound like you want to understand initiatives, the business economics of the situation. Like, how many deals do we really need to close to make this worth our while? Like, tell me what that looks like. And I think that's offering up a seat at the table and getting you, I don't want to say recognition because it's not recognition. It's just having somebody be like, wow, she gets it. And our events really have a better chance moving forward here.
Yeah, so I think what you might be trying to say is like once you're able to kind of lean into that curiosity and understand the why, then you're suddenly able to kind of create that strategy and create that
Yes.
POV.
Yes.
I think it's important, right? Like it's so easy to kind of show up and say, hey, like, okay, I need a 20 by 20. I need one like banner
Yeah.
and we're gonna display XYZ. But when you suddenly ask the question why, you're suddenly going in and leaning into more
Mhm.
purpose.
Yep.
And then you're able to also provide a POV. Like you're not just the one taking the orders, you're the one kind of coming in with a recommendation on what next steps should be or what this vision should look like, how to bring it to life. So I think, yeah, lean into the curiosity. Like, I
Yep.
think it just helps you understand the various nuances of marketing because not one department is the same. You
I
need it
think
all.
it really is when you start asking better questions in that sense and you are curious, it gives you twofold. One, it gains you the understanding of what needs to be accomplished so you can deliver better strategy through the events. And two, it does to a degree put you in better standing at your company. You then become someone that gets it. You're someone that is understanding the bigger picture versus just the execution. And I think that's vital. The next thing you're talking about was gut and data. I love that. I think there is a lot of data. It shows data is a very touch and go feel with associations and exhibitors and who says what. But I love what you're saying about like, hey, it's great that you have gut. but I think you also need data. You need the show's data. And I also think you need your own data year over year over year, where you have your own to then make better decisions. Do you have any like specifics that you look at in terms of data or things, that you're requesting from the show or building out yourself that you're making sure that you look at?
So overall, yes, data is very important, and I think it does vary company to company. It goes back to like what does success look like? What metrics are you being asked to track? And then adhering to it, right? Like we
Yeah.
look at data, like when we're running some of these events, we're trying to understand what the next steps are. Like at Benjamin Moore, we would get an influx of all these leads, and we're like, well, where does it go next? How do we
Mhm.
track it and say like this person came by and they bought this many gallons of paint? So it's understanding like the impact to the business or the impact to the awareness that you're having. And some of that stuff is like it's immediate. Like if an article is going to go viral or if it's going to get picked up by multiple news outlets. The popularity of something or the initial reaction to a new product launch. But it's what happens the 60 days, the 90 days, the 200 days, the 300 days, the 1 year
Mhm.
later. What story is the audience remembering?
I want to get to goal setting and objectives, right? Because I think goal setting and objectives are really important. I think too often, I've been doing this 12, 13 years. Wow. I've been feel like that Kevin Hart thing with Don Cheadle where he's like, Don Cheadle says how old is he is, and Kevin Hart's like, what? And then he's like, that's how I feel. Yeah.
You hesitate, yeah.
Yeah, that's how I feel right now. But anyway, I feel like what's so important about it is I've had all these conversations over time. When you ask people for goals and objectives, they're a lot of times they're really not prepared with them. They're already in the process of wanting to talk about the booth and this and that, but like they don't have
That's
goals.
the fun stuff.
Yeah, like they don't have objectives. And I'm like, well, first of all, you need these, in my opinion, to do the booth design, to do the engagement design, all those things like that. So tell me about goal setting, objectives, how you've done it, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, obviously, I think it's very important. Like I said earlier, like I think aligning those internal stakeholders so that everyone's understanding what those objectives are is really key and important. I think a lot of it is just having
Do you
working
get them?
sessions
Sorry,
with
do you
those.
get them from multiple stakeholders? Do you feel like,
Yeah,
meaning like where people are
absolutely.
coming and saying like, because I feel like you start going to your stakeholders and they're like, I need this, this, and this. I need this, this, this. I need this, this, and this. So are
Yeah.
you kind of deciphering
Well,
which ones? Are you kind of curating it?
I think it's understanding who your main stakeholders are. Like think of it like you always got someone from sales, you always have someone from a product side, you'll probably always have someone from any other. I'm trying to think of like, like a demand gen
Marketing
side might have,
leadership,
yeah, marketing leadership,
your
like those
CFO
those are like
sometimes.
your,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah, like those stakeholders, like, and I'm not saying like if you have like 20 stakeholders, don't like invite all 20 of them to a session. Like you're gonna
You'll never
that's
get out.
asking for
You'll
you'll
never get
never get
out
out
alive. Yeah.
alive,
Yeah.
like I think it's identifying like who your key stakeholders are. And a process of what I do is like I'll kind of, if I have an idea, you have like I'll kind of filter it out to a couple of folks and I'm like, what do you think of this? And then tweak it as I
Yeah.
go, to kind of get to that end game. Or it would be like, okay, let's have like a working session with these core, you know five or
Yeah.
six, like, not too many voices in a room
Yeah.
but the key stakeholders in there. And you're like, okay, what are your goals? What are your goals? And we just do a working session through like the visions, the values, the obstacles, the metrics, and the methods. And I think through that, then it turns into like, okay, like break out again. And it's like a constant moving, it's not final. Like your objectives can change, as I said, like it's remaining flexible. But I think having that locked down together from all your stakeholders is important, because the person that's running sales is not going to be aligned to what product is trying to tell you. Like you need to make sure that they're seeing eye to eye.
Yeah.
So when you're going to go and start making decisions for your booth, you're not, it just makes it easier when everyone's aligned, right? Versus like, otherwise you're going to try and sit there and please everybody and
Yeah.
you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to be able to make decisions because you don't know who has the final
Mm.
say.
I think with making decisions, right? Like when you have the goals and then you have objectives. Objectives to me are really like what are the motions and activities that you're trying to do and hit to create those goals for, for with happening is like too many people they put the cart ahead of the horse, right? So when we're talking booth design, when we're talking the overall approach, when we're talking offsite activations, when we're talking like engagement and the motions that we want people to go through, pre-show mark, like all these things to me, they have to feed into the goals. So it's
Yeah.
like, I feel like I could talk goals and purpose and things all day, but it's like my overarching thought on it is like, okay, pull me down the line into a different conversation and I'm going to stop you and I'm going to say, well, tell me the goals, because if these ideas don't tie back to the goals, I think they're bullshit. Like, I think they're just some idea that you're like, oh yeah, let's do this. And like, well, does it tie back to what you're trying to accomplish? They should be your
They should.
foundation guide. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they should always be cohesive, right? Like
Yep.
it goes back to exactly what you're saying. Like everything that you're doing, it's all going back to that touch point that's going to be live, which is, let's say it's the booth or it's the attendance at the show. And if you have all your stakeholders kind of like all over the place like this, no one's going to walk away feeling like they reached success, right? Like, so I think it's very, very important, like to have a very clear vision. And it's exactly that. Like from like a vendor standpoint or from a decision standpoint, if something's being done that doesn't make sense back to that V2 mom, go back to it and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't align. Are we tweaking this? Because this is an evergreen document. We can change this up until the day before if we wanted, but
Mhm.
it's making sure that you have this set so this looks like success.
I think it also lets you, like you're saying, it lets you kind of benchmark backwards. Like once
Totally.
everything's done, you're going back and like, did we, because if you don't have them and you go forward, because we're talking about what? We're talking about having purpose, having goals. We're talking about what does success look like? Well, if you don't have these things written out and then you get down the line and people are like, oh, that show sucked. Oh yeah, we don't have leads. We're like, well, did we want those leads? Or is this what we were here
Exactly.
for? So like, it just disrupts the whole thing when you don't have that stuff lined up. You can go back, you can make adjustments,
Yeah.
you can say like, we came here for this, it didn't happen, but
Yeah.
this is what happened. Is this worth our while? And now you start talking
Yeah.
about what next year looks like.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that, it goes back to like that piece of the follow up to the customer is important, but that
Mm,
piece of the follow up to your internal stakeholders is important too.
yeah.
Hey, we just wrapped up at blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
This is what our outcomes were. And by the way, if you have any feedback, put them in this document for me and like, let's talk about it. So when we're going and doing this again, if we're doing this again, we have a starting point for next year of what we need to build off of.
How important? So I think it's interesting you said that on the after side. How important is it, do you think, to relay what happened, whether it's sort of like quantitatively with actual data or qualitatively with like facts, with like, your gut things? How important is it to relay it back to stakeholders immediately for for the idea of like what happens next at the event and people knowing what's going on? I mean, how seems important.
I mean, it's very critical, right? Like if you don't, I think it goes back to like understanding a lot of like what the audience of your podcast is like you got to be able to toot your own horn, right? Like
Mm.
this was successful. This was a lot of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears that went into this activation. If you're not tooting your own horn, like, and you're waiting around for someone else to do it, you might be waiting around for a really long time. I think it's sharing those results in a
Mm.
timely fashion. I would say probably within a week of the end of the show, or once you're able to get those like, the data that you want to share out, the metrics that you want to share out, you're able to show it, and then also look at it from like last year. Like, did you do better this year compared to last year? What were key learnings that you may have had? Like sharing that up front, I think again will set you aside too. I think we're not perfect, right? Like no one is perfect. So it's again, better, never best. How do you improve it each time around? And I think a part of that is also just being open to feedback on, hey, like this could have been better from constructive feedback
Mhm.
on this could have
Yeah.
been better from this angle. And here's why. So capturing all of that so you have a starting point for the next person or like the next year, I think is really important.
And I asked about that because I feel like I haven't heard that a ton from people about the follow up. So, okay, so you've asked for stakeholders' time to develop goals and objectives and purpose and to get them on the same page leading into this. Then all this happens. I think
Mm-hmm.
you owe it to go back to be able to
Yeah.
say, hey, look, this is what we want to do accomplish. I won't have all the results for 6 months or this, it'll curate over time, but here's all the positives that happen. Here's maybe the things I'm worried about. And now you're just putting together this little report or this little idea to basically say, hey, like, we put a bunch of work into this. Here's where we're at. Here's what went well. Here are the, what's a good term for it? Positive signals, right? That
Yeah.
people want to be able to see. Now I feel like that's traction for the event team and stakeholders. Now, next time you ask a stakeholder to sit and talk about goals, initiatives, objectives, what do you want out of this? They're not going to be like, oh man, she's just burning my time here, right? They're going to be like, no,
Yeah.
let's do it. Let's do it.
Exactly. I think it's keeping that conversation going, right? Like it doesn't, it's just like networking, right? Like you don't want to like not talk to somebody for a year and then just suddenly pop up and be like, hey,
Hey, here
when
I
you need
am.
something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think it's keeping it lukewarm and keeping that conversation going because like the chances are you're probably going to work with them again. The chances are that like, you might have to ask for more budget, and
Yeah.
if you're transparent about how the success of the event went from the get-go, you're going to get your buy-in for the next time is going to be so much easier.
Awesome. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed having you on. I'm glad we kind of touched through a lot of the journey of a trade show, and I feel like you did a great job of tying back to a lot of the foundational things, which was great. I appreciate you coming on. This was an absolute blast.
Well, thanks for having me. I had fun too.
You got it. Thanks everybody for tuning in. It's another episode of Event Market Redefined. We will catch you next time. Also check for our summer tour and our live shows. Hope to see you on there for a little Q&A, and we'll catch everybody next time. Thank you so much.